I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new t-shirt. It's your new t-shirt.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning to you. Thank you for joining me this Sunday. Welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Another hectic week in Westminster. We've seen the autumn statement, which of course did give workers a national insurance cut, but left us with the highest tax burden since the Second World War. The Office for National Statistics has released figures this week showing that net migration had hit a record level of 745,000 in 2022. Should that figure come down, and how? And this weekend, a humanitarian pause has allowed for the release of some of the Israeli hostages in return for Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli prisons. We've got a range of top guests, as ever, to talk you through all of that. I'm going to be joined by the Home Office Minister, Laura Farris. How are the government going to bring down those sky-high net migration figures? I'll also be speaking to senior Tory Tobias Ellwood for his thoughts on the Middle East. We'll get a Labour view, of course, as ever, from Steve McCabe. He chairs the Labour Friends of Israel, so will no doubt have something to say about his colleagues' constant demands for a ceasefire. Mark Littlewood, who runs Liz Truss's favourite think tank, the IEA, will give us his reaction to the autumn statement. And I'm going to be joined by Benjamin Netanyahu's ally, the senior Israeli politician Ayelet Shaked, the former Israeli Justice Minister and Home Secretary. So, as I said, a jam-packed show after a jam-packed week. Let's have a look at the newspapers now with Sam Lister, Daily Express's political editor. Sam, lovely to see you this morning. I mean, as we would expect, because of those migration figures coming in the week, the front pages are talking about Rwanda once again. Sunday Express, so your sister paper, the front page, stop small boats or we're sunk. And the Sunday Telegraph talking to this row that seems to have erupted between the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, and the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick. Is it a bigger problem for the Tories that they haven't stopped the boats, or that the legal migration figure is so high, a record high, in fact?
I think with the small boats, it's a very physical symbol of the issue. And so people can actually see people crossing the channel illegally on the small boats. That really is a problem for the Conservatives. And I think in many ways they have to make headway on that. First, the legal migration is obviously huge, but it's the breaching of the borders that people can physically see that is the real problem for them on the doorstep.
When you hear from your readers, are you saying that they are more angry about kind of illegal channel crossings, but they can't be particularly happy about these figures? I mean, adding 10 million to the population since 2010 is extraordinary, isn't it?
It's huge, it's huge. And I think also when people voted for Brexit, they voted to take back control, didn't they? And they wanted to see control of our borders, and they wanted to see control of who's coming in and out of the country. Now, the government would say, we have got control, we've got a points-based system, we choose who comes in and out. But people did not vote for Brexit to see the figures going up and up and up in this way. And obviously, since 2010, the Conservatives have promised to bring down legal migration to the tens of thousands.
Yes, we remember that pledge. David Cameron, Theresa May. Not sure what happened to it.
It's been readjusted in the recent years to just lower the number. I don't think they now stick to the tens of thousands pledge. But actually, all we've seen since that point is that it goes up and up and up, and that is a real problem for them.
And this Tory row, this row going on in Cabinet between Cleverly and Jenrick, tell me a bit about that then. We think that Robert Jenrick is kind of the last man standing on behalf of the right, in the absence of Suella Braverman, in trying to push for this Rwanda plan to take off, literally and figuratively. But then you've got James Cleverly, who has used, I won't use the language on a Sunday morning, but he sort of described the Rwanda plan as lacking. And he's also seems to be sceptical about the idea of processing people overseas full stop.
Yeah, it's very interesting because Rishi Sunak put Robert Jenrick into the Home Office as a kind of almost somebody to temper Suella Braverman. And actually, from discussions I've had, I think when Robert Jenrick went into that department, he was quite liberal when it came to immigration. He saw what was happening firsthand and has now become very radical on it. Now, the same is true for James Cleverly, in that Conservative MPs tell me that he went into the Foreign Office, and he's been captured by the officials in the Foreign Office.
Oh,
so he's
goodness.
become very liberal. So you've got this war in the Home Office now between James Cleverly and Robert Jenrick.
Secretaries of State getting captured by their department seems to be like a running saw going throughout the last administration and beyond. The Prime Minister has spoken. Sam, he's spoken to the Mail on Sunday. What's he said?
He's talking about the autumn statement, how well that's gone. He's talking about how he intends to bring down legal migration. It's quite a wide-ranging interview. It was on the back of the announcement earlier this week that Nissan was planning to expand its electrical vehicle operation, and that's obviously a good news story. It's a Brexit bounce, if you will. Nissan was obviously quite sceptical about Brexit, but has now seemingly managed to find ways to work with Brexit, so that's a good news story. Yes, it's quite an interesting interview there.
And he's saying that there are more tax cuts to come. Well, he kind of has to say that, because actually I thought the reception from the right-wing press to the budget was fairly supportive. They actually enjoyed a few positive headlines for once. Having said that, that was because the coverage was saying, well, this is a good start, but you need to go a lot further. I mean, I think by spring, the budget that's announced in spring, if it doesn't have big, what we would call retail giveaways, they're in even more serious doo-doo than they all are already. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Prime Minister told my paper on the day of the autumn statement that there would be more to come. That was his phrase, more to come. So we are very, very clearly expecting the spring budget to be a much bigger tax-cutting event than the autumn statement was. They clearly are on this kind of, they call it a path to tax cuts. We're entering a general election period. They clearly have to make a big bang in spring if they've got any chance of kind of going out there and really taking the fight to people.
What do you think about these theories about they'll bring the election forward to May rather than autumn because of that idea that they're going to instigate the NI cut from January rather than waiting till April? And everyone was like, oh, it's electioneering.
Yeah, I think it did set a lot of hairs racing in Westminster, but I think actually, I don't think most people within the party think that is what's going to happen here. You need time for these things to take effect. You actually need to hammer home the message over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the message has been quite negative for quite a long time on the economy. So the party has to really have a good year of saying, look, things have improved if they've got any chance of making that stick with voters.
Let's have a look at the Sunday Times front page involving one of our own at GB News. The allegation that Lee Anderson has said he was offered a lot of money to defect to Reform. I mean, Reform are saying they haven't offered anyone any money. It's not a new story, this, is it, Sam?
No, these allegations first emerged back in February when the Conservative Party received reports of MPs being approached, and they complained to the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle. Now, we've not heard any kind of results of any investigation he's done, but now we know who the MP, well, certainly one of the MPs was.
I mean, to be fair, Mr Anderson is caught on camera sort of talking about how he's been offered a lot of money to cross the floor. I mean, it speaks to me of a degree, if true, and again, Reform deny it. Desperation from Reform. I mean, they're 10 or 11 points ahead in the polls, yet they haven't got the political heft they need. They clearly need some, so they may well have been approaching Tories. But, I mean, does it seem likely that any are going to go across and go to Reform? I don't think so.
I think it would be highly unlikely. I mean, it's hard to kind of overestimate how angry Tory MPs are about Reform. They think Reform is out to destroy them. They want Reform wants to change the voting system to bring in PR. So they could get seats in Parliament. They've got no chance of doing that at the moment. So it really is quite... The Conservative MPs feel quite bitter about the Reform, the way Reform's approaching things. So I think it's very unlikely that...
Also, it doesn't help Reform that Nigel Farage, another GB News colleague, keeps on flirting with the idea of joining the Tories. It's like he's been in the jungle talking about, oh, well, I wouldn't rule it out. You know, I don't think that's particularly helpful.
He wants to be Conservative Party leaders, and by 2026, I think that's what he's been talking about.
How big a threat are Reform to the Tories? I mean, as I say, they're sort of polling at 10 or 11, which is obviously higher than had been the case. I remember hearing that somebody in CCHQ said, you know, if Reform get to 10%, we are, in inverted commas, again, another word I can't read on a Sunday morning. I mean, is that true? Because, of course, a vote for Reform could just be allowing Labour to storm through and win a load of seats in the Red Wall.
Well, this is exactly the problem. Although Reform don't have any chance under the current system of winning any seats in Parliament, they do have the chance to really, really thwart the Conservatives' chances of being, you know, anywhere in a good place at the election. What they will do is actually allow Labour to come in through the back. So they will... If they get a few thousand votes in across the Red Wall in each seat, then that is enough to allow Labour to win victory at the next election.
Let's have a little and finally moment. Hold the front page, Sun on Sunday splash. Charles, Harry is a fool. Is this news? Prince Harry in idiot shock. What's going on here? Omid Scobie, who doesn't know the Sussex and has never spoken to them in the past and certainly hasn't collaborated with his various hagiography of the couple, has got a new book out. Briefly, Sam.
He's completely impartial journalist, is Omid. Yes. I think you know... as you say, Camilla, I mean, it's not for me to judge Harry's intellect on the...
Well, no, we wouldn't want to do that. But Charles seems to think he was a fool for writing Spare and, indeed, pouring out his soul on Netflix.
I think many people might agree with that.
Yes, indeed. We agree with the King, perhaps, on this one. Sam Lister, thank you, as ever, this morning for joining me to go through the papers. There you have it. Well, we're going to get into some of the stories of the week, and we're going to start doing that by speaking to Tobias Ellwood, former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tory MP for Bournemouth East. Tobias, lovely to see you on this Sunday morning. Thank you for your company. Look, is migration too high? Are the Tories fast becoming the party of mass migration, with this figure that suggests that 745,000 came into the country in 2022, a new record?
Well, I think, well, good morning. I think Laura Farris is going to be able to give more details on this. But yes, the numbers are too high. And just to place it into context, they are actually similar numbers that are being received in Germany, in France, in Italy, in other places. And I think what we're missing is an opportunity to actually work together with other nations, because the source of many of these places of where they're coming from are the same. And there needs to be a more collective approach to dealing with that, putting out the fires. Why do these people want to leave those places in the first place? And I think that's where I would like the debate to actually go. Yeah. Britain is not isolated in this. These numbers are far too high. Yes, that's the direct answer.
What should
do we
they
need
be?
To do something about it? Yes. But ultimately, like I said, it's they are very similar. In fact, we're in a better place than some of our continental counterparts, but we're not working together. We're not putting the challenges out across the world, ironically, in places that we've wandered into: Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. You know, the West has wandered in, tried to deal with a dictator, then strategically lost patience, and then extracted ourselves, only to leave insecurity, poor governance, humanitarian challenges. And then we wonder why those people then want to move somewhere else. And I just say the situation is going to get much, much worse. As climate change starts to grip Africa, we're going to see biblical movements of people. So there needs to be a much more holistic international effort to deal with this issue.
I mean, David Cameron and indeed Theresa May talked about the numbers being down into the tens of thousands. Is that realistic? Would you support that kind of reduction?
Yes, I would, but you need a plan to do so. You need something that's going to recognise We're dealing with the criminal gangs. The numbers are actually down because we also had economic migrants tied into that. Don't forget what happened with Albania specifically. We dealt with that issue as well. But ultimately, let's say we're not looking at this, I think, from the wider positioning, and that's what I think we now need to do.
Could I find perhaps a rare note of agreement with your former nemesis, Boris Johnson, here, Tobias, because he's suggesting that we should raise the income needed for a visa to £40,000 a year. Is that a good idea?
Certainly, I think we need to look at all this. I did cross swords with Boris a few times. There's many things we do agree on. One of them is Ukraine, certainly, and our international status positioning. I think Britain is rekindling its statecraft of what we do on the international stage. And that's been, I think, reflected by our Prime Minister, the new Rishi Sunak, going to the Middle East, and now David Cameron coming back into the ranks as well. A formidable, I think, capability back in able to project, I think, Britain's role and influence on the international stage.
Although it was quite interesting to hear Lord Cameron say in the week that he wanted a closer alliance with the EU on international and security and defence matters. And yet, at the same time, we've just seen the Spanish and Belgian PMs go out and give a press conference at the Rafah crossing where they were very, very critical of Israel. I mean, is that helpful?
Well, there's 2 points you raised there. Can we do anything in our world without collaboration with our international partners? The answer to that is no. Can Britain influence? Yes. We have convening power. We have soft power. We have hard power. We have the ability to work very closely with the United States. So as we've done a number of times in the last century, we should be doing the same in this century. We can't do all the heavy lifting, but as we've earned our place on the permanent membership on the United Nations Security Council, we can bring other nations together. The idea that individual nations then go out and do their own thing shows how disparate perhaps the international community has become. And that's being taken advantage of, I have to say, by authoritarian states across the world. We spent 3 decades, I'm afraid, becoming too complacent. There are a lot of fires around the world, and the West's threshold to deal with disturbance, instability, I'm afraid, is increasingly being tested.
But you want closer EU ties then, Tobias, but it must worry you, the election of people like Geert Wilders in Holland, maybe even Meloni in Italy. I mean, there is a tendency within some of these EU states to become more right-wing, which is kind of the opposite of your politics.
No, actually, it's a consequence of the fact that populism comes in when we don't work together, and when you see increasing migrant numbers and you see increasing authoritarianism affecting globalization. And it's not just places like Holland, it's also Slovakia as well. And Hungary has already got there. It shows that when collectively we work together in the same direction, we can actually have an impact. But when we start to dissipate and disagree, then that's when populism rises. Look what's going on in the United States at the moment. And that's very, very dangerous indeed. You know, the leader of the West being so involved in domestic matters, taking their eye off what's going on the international place. I really do fear that we're sliding into a Cold War, and our world is going to splinter into 2 spheres of competing influence because the West is not working more closely together, and countries such as Holland are then turning in on themselves because people get frustrated, and that frustration then is expressed in people like Wilders being elected.
OK. I mean, we've seen Nigel Farage in the jungle. I don't know if you've been following I'm a Celebrity, not ruling out the possibility of one day leading the Conservative Party. If that happened, would you remain a Tory MP?
A lot of big questions there. Whether he's even going to make it out of the jungle, I really don't know.
Would you
content.
Would you be in the same party as Nigel Farage, Tobias?
No. Probably the answer to that is no. Look, to make it really clear what the Conservative Party is about, the One Nation Conservative Party wins elections. Look back at our history. I've said this numerous times. You know, when we aim for the centre-right ground of British politics, we win elections. When we move to our extreme, then I'm afraid we put ourselves in opposition. And the same as with Labour when they went for Jeremy Corbyn. Where did they go? The sweet spot in British politics is when you aim for the centre-right ground.
You say that, though, Tobias. Wasn't Margaret...
did that. Churchill did that. Baldwin did that. Disraeli did that. David Cameron did that as well.
Did Boris do that?
Years of us in opposition. eventually we got re-elected. And the same, I'm afraid, that is where Rishi Sunak is trying to take the party. And if we look united, if we look resolved, if we look competent, if we have that vision, then yes, we can stay
I know,
number
but
10.
you say that
And
Boris
if we look
united
divided, then that's not going to happen.
I mean, Boris didn't really unite the party, even though you might characterise him as libertarian. Would Thatcher want to be described as a one-nation Tory?
No, Boris's election was quite specific. You know, we were dealing with Jeremy Corbyn, so that was an advantage. Make it really clear what the Conservatives stood for. We were not Jeremy Corbyn. And then there was this let's resolve Brexit. You remember the few years of civil war there was, not just in the country, but it's certainly in politics as well. And he said, I can solve that. And that's what took him across the line in 2019. The world's very, very different now. The whole issue of Brexit it doesn't really register in that same way. We're all post-Brexiteers. From that perspective.
Tobias Elwood, if you're a Brexiteer, I may well be a cat. This is exciting for me to hear that you have come over to the dark side, finally, Tobias.
You missed a key word there, which is post-Brexiteers. Most people in Britain accept the result. What they don't accept is where we've landed with Brexit. All these people saying it's going to be utopia, the grass is going to be greener. It is not, because economically we've not got the best deal. And there are various views on where we should have landed. Most people who either voted Remain or voted Brexit did not expect us to land where we are today. And there is an improved Brexit deal to be had.
Tobias, I can't agree with you more that we do need to see more of our Brexit opportunities. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Laura Farris now. She's the Safeguarding Minister based in the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. Nice to see you this morning, Minister. Thank you for sparing the time on a Sunday morning. Can we talk about these migration figures? Are the Tory party now the party of mass migration?
No, Camilla. I accept without reservation that the figures last week were too high. But the government is now, first of all, some of the reason for that was because of things like the Ukraine scheme that we've run, and also the offer to BNO passport holders, that's British passport holders in Hong Kong, following the Chinese crackdown.
Yeah.
So there have been one or two one-off events that have led to very, very large numbers, more than 100,000 people coming in on visas, humanitarian visas that reflect our values and were the right thing to do. I think many would agree.
Yes.
But it's also true, when you look at the principal sort of worker categories, there were large numbers of students and large numbers coming in to fill vacancies in the health and care sector, also bringing in large numbers of dependents. Now, we've already addressed that in relation to students, and the ONS forecast that will bring numbers down considerably. But it's quite obvious that there's further to go on that, particularly the issue of dependents. And I would also just gently flag, and you'll have heard this yourself in the autumn statement, there was a huge thrust towards getting people who are currently on incapacity benefits back into some form of work, filling the vacancies in the labour market as a way of offsetting and trying to reduce the numbers coming in.
I completely take the point you're making about Hong Kong and indeed Ukraine and indeed the student visa changes. But at the same time, we have historically heard from successive Tory administrations a desire to get immigration down to the tens of thousands. It's been above 200 or 300,000 literally since David Cameron has been in power. So unfortunately, our audience feels betrayed by your promises. You talked in the 2019 Tory manifesto about having this Australian points-based system to control immigration. The perception is with these numbers, and indeed with the tens of thousands still arriving in the Channel by boat, that migration, legal and illegal, is completely out of control under your watch. You must accept that, otherwise you are taking our audience for fools.
I wouldn't dream of taking your audience for fools, actually. And I accept without reservation that the numbers are too high. It is really important to look into the component parts of that rather than just presenting it as one single issue. There is definitely an issue with the numbers coming over and the numbers of dependents that they're bringing. And it is absolutely right that the measures that we're announcing or that are coming forward will look at that and will be directed at bringing overall numbers down. Could I just address separately what you were saying about illegal migration across the Channel, because one of the really important points is that the measures that the Prime Minister put in, actually in the weeks after he became Prime Minister, first of all, a comprehensive returns agreement with Albania, and secondly, robust new border protections in France. Collectively, they have brought the number of small boats crossing the Channel this year down by over 30%. At the same time as the number of illegal migrants crossing the Mediterranean into continental Europe has gone up by 80%. So that's not just a real terms drop, it's a very significant relative drop. Just as pressure is building in continental Europe, we are driving numbers down. Now, you know, Camilla, that the next stage of that is going to be the emergency legislation that's brought forward to deal with Rwanda, because we only create a complete deterrent across the English Channel if we can say, if you arrive here but at the hands of a people smuggler, illegally, then you will have no right now or ever to asylum in the United Kingdom, making it completely not worth their while.
But there does seem to be a row within Cabinet about the Rwanda plan. On one hand, we've got Robert Jenrick pushing this plan. It was Suella Braverman's plan as well, and he worked under her. But on the other hand, we've got James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, was the Foreign Secretary, now the Home Secretary, so not an insignificant role that he's playing on all this. He's previously described the plan in quite unsavoury terms. He doesn't seem to be a supporter of it. And he said that Rwanda isn't the be-all and end-all, reportedly. So you've now got a Home Secretary seemingly at odds with his own immigration minister about the government's flagship policy to stop the boats.
No, I want to be clear. In the interview which you're referring to, I think it was yesterday's interview, the Home Secretary described Rwanda as a really important part of our plan. I think the point that he was making is it isn't just Rwanda that's enabled us to get the numbers down significantly, but I want to make absolutely clear that we see Rwanda as a very, very important element of our next strategy, which is you create a complete deterrent by removing the incentive to take those routes.
No, we understand the plan. It's just this idea of there being tensions in the Home Office at a time when this policy is absolutely integral, not just to stopping the boats, but seemingly the government's chances of being re-elected. I know what you're saying about James Cleverly, but at the end of the day, he has been widely quoted, and it hasn't been disputed, that he thought this plan was bat something crazy. That's not an endorsement of the plan, is it?
There is nothing that I have detected that suggests any schism in the Home Office. I've only been in post for 2 weeks, but I've been to a couple of meetings related to this, and I have detected complete cohesion on where we're going next. One of the things about the Supreme Court's decision on Rwanda was that it was a focused criticism. It was completely centred on the issue of refoulement, which is language adopted from the Refugee Convention, which means that Rwanda has placed people at risk historically of being returned to their country of origin before their asylum claim has been determined.
Minister, we're running out of time, so a quick yes-no answer to the following question, please. Will flights to Rwanda take off next year, yes or no?
Yes.
OK, thank you very much indeed for that, Laura Farris. Thank you for joining me this morning. Lots more to come on today's programme. We're going to get the view from the Labour Party, from the Birmingham MP, Steve McCabe, in just a minute. Don't go anywhere. Lots more to come. We'll be back soon.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. We've got a jam-packed hour ahead for you. I'm going to be speaking to Israel's former Justice and Interior Minister for her take on the hostage releases later in the hour. All of that and more after the news with Sophia Wensler.
It's 10 o'clock. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB Newsroom. Reports say the Israel government has received the list of hostages who are stated to be released today. An official familiar with the matter told the Times of Israel that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office are notifying the families of those and the loved ones of those on the list. It's the third day of a 4-day truce, which Qatar says earlier today it hopes will be extended further with the release of more abductees. Meanwhile, smoke can be seen at the Gaza border on the third day of the truce between Israel and Hamas. The first batch of humanitarian aid supplies arrived in the northern Gaza Strip yesterday, on day 2 of the 4-day ceasefire. 9-year-old Irish-Israeli girl Emily Hand has been reunited with her father following her release by Hamas. She is among 17 hostages released by the terrorist group after 50 days in captivity. 13 Israelis, 6 women and 7 children, along with 4 Thai nationals, were transported out of Gaza through the Rafah border crossing. Video released by Hamas shows women and children being taken into Red Cross vehicles. The IDF says the released hostages are now in Israel and are reuniting with their family while being medically assessed. A delay to the process was resolved through mediation by Egypt and Qatar. Chairman of Kibbutz Be'eri, Amit Solv, is relieved to see Emily Hand released.
Emily Hand is a closure for me because, unfortunately, I'm the one who told her father that she has been found murdered. And a week later, I'm the one who told the father that she probably captured. So it's a kind of a relief for me that she's still alive, she's here, she's with us, and I have to tell her father to give him a hug.
39 Palestinians have been released from a prison in the West Bank in exchange for the Israeli hostages. Hundreds of Palestinians welcomed the freed prisoners in the early hours this morning. Crowds cheered, clapped and waved flags in the streets as buses of prisoners arrived. It's understood 6 women and 33 children are among the freed prisoners in the second batch of the exchange deal. The Met Police has arrested 18 people during pro-Palestine protests in London. 5 on suspicion of inciting or distributing material likely to stir up racial hatred, and 2 on suspicion of supporting a prescribed terrorist organisation. The arrest took place as tens of thousands of people marched through central London calling for a ceasefire. Police handed out leaflets to provide absolute clarity on what will be deemed an offence. Later on today, there'll be a march in the capital organised by the charity Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Around 50,000 people are expected to attend. This is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Camilla.
Thanks, Sophia. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lots more still to come. In just a minute, I'll be joined by Mark Littlewood, who runs Liz Truss's favourite think tank, the IEA, who's going to join me in the studio. I'm also going to be joined by Labour MP Steve McCabe. Israel's former Justice and Interior Minister, Ayelet Shaked, will give us her views on the hostage deal. And I'll be joined by one of the organisers of today's March Against Anti-Semitism, which is taking place in London a little later. And the author of a new biography, Meeting Churchill, joins me in the studio to discuss his new book. Well, let's bring Mark Littlewood into the conversation now. He's Director General of the Institute for Economic Affairs, the IEA. Mark, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you for sparing the time on a Sunday.
Great to be with you.
Let's get your reaction, first of all, to the autumn statement. What was good, what was bad?
Yeah, when I listened to it and Jeremy Hunt sat down, I probably gave it about a 7 out of 10. And the more I thought about it, the more that number has dropped, actually.
Dear.
And I think the most intriguing thing about it, but also the most frustrating, if you looked at the newspapers the next day, some newspapers were saying huge tax cuts, and other headlines were the highest tax burden that we've ever had.
This is the problem.
And actually, both are true, because if the Chancellor stands up and does nothing, literally says, I've decided not to change the tax system at all, I commend this statement to the House, and sits down, taxes go up because more and more of us get dragged in. So actually his offset, if you like, of reducing national insurance, a small step in the right direction, but inexorably tax is going up and up and up. I think that is bad for the economy and bad for growth.
Is that just, I mean, I know that this is not going to be the IEA's argument because we shouldn't be sort of fatalistic and complacent about tax going up so highly, but is it not just as a result of our ageing population, our huge demand on public services, ever more billions being pumped into the NHS, that this is the new normal that we're going to have to accept? What's the counter-narrative to that? Cut spending, because the Tories aren't going to be popular if they introduce yet more austerity measures.
Yeah, I mean, I get a bit frustrated, Camilla, about the austerity sort of discussion, because I don't think we've had any of it. Austerity, to my mind, is living well within your means. So a government that's practising austerity would be running unnecessarily high budget surpluses every year. In fact, we've been running budget deficits for 20 years. You're right, there is a demographic problem. An ageing population means there's more burden on the taxpayer in general. But that is a political choice. You don't just need to drift along with that. We now have a welfare bill every year in excess of £340 billion. I mean, this is more than 10 grand per household per year. This is extraordinary, and we still haven't wiped out poverty. So I think you've got to look at the spending side of the ledger. You're right, the Conservative government seems to be unimaginative or reluctant in doing so, because ultimately, if you want to get tax down, you've got to get spending down.
But if he had come up with a kind of kamikaze-style mini-budget, he would have landed in trouble with the markets, wouldn't he? I mean, this idea of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng trying something more radical, which was welcomed with open arms by the IEA at the time, then blew up in their faces. Is it seemingly impossible because of pressure from the Treasury, pressure from the markets, and other, I suppose, pressures externally coming in from all directions, that actually that approach to the budget and that kind of idea of free market capitalism and a return to kind of Thatcherite economic policies just simply isn't workable in the 21st century?
Oh, I think it is workable, but my God, you need one hell of a lot of political will. I think one of the stories of the short-lived Truss premiership was the range of forces against her were absolutely colossal, not least within her own party. Half the Conservative Party didn't really want her to try and do what she was trying to do.
Although, I mean, unfunded pledges and
that's exactly right.
Completely wrong.
No, I agree with that. And actually, where the IEA and myself were critical of her is if you want to get spending, if you want to get taxes down, you've got to get spending down more or less in lockstep. But we've got to be a bit careful here. Everybody goes screaming mad about unfunded tax cuts, and they're right to. But we've had an awful lot of unfunded government spending over the past 20 years. Nobody seems to worry about that. So it's as if unfunded tax cuts are a particularly toxic problem, but colossal public spending, with God only knows how we're going to pay for it, isn't. Now, we've got to get, I think, both down. That requires some difficult political decisions and some huge trade-offs.
Also, colossal public spending, while at the same time satisfaction with public services is at an all-time low. Wasn't it quite good politics from Jeremy Hunt last week to push Rachel Reeves into a corner and basically say, I think he's saying, you know, we expect departmental spending to be stagnant for the next 5 years. So then she has to be forced to take the decision, because who knows what they're going to inherit. It's not going to be particularly pretty if Labour get into power. A Hobson's choice between putting taxes up or cutting spending.
That's right. And, I mean, we have, I think, now reached the limits of tax and spend in Britain. And if Labour were to win the next election, and the opinion polls suggest that's by far the most likely outcome, they are not going to inherit the sort of golden economic legacy that Tony Blair inherited when Labour last came to power. The economy was in pretty good shape way back in 1997. So some very, very difficult choices. But here's the rub, I think. If it were to be Labour's position that they want to dial up taxes even further in order to have yet more public spending, I think in practical terms that's going to be hard to do. We are now taxing the UK economy at around about, we're heading to about 38% of national income is being hoovered up by the Treasury in taxes of one kind or the other. And over our lifetimes, that's about the most the Treasury can hoover up. If you dial it beyond that, you actually start to lose money. People quit work early, leave the country.
And then the argument contrary to that will be public services are in a state, 7.8 nearly million people on NHS waiting lists, you know, potholes aren't being filled, people can't seem to get anything done, we pull a lever, somebody pulls it in the opposite direction, etc., etc.
No, that's exactly right. But going back to what your previous question, Camilla, you implied, or I inferred, that it doesn't seem that throwing more money at these services
so reform
actually leads to...
We've
clearly got to reform our healthcare system. Intriguingly, the Labour Party and Wes Streeting seem to be rather more open about that than the Conservatives. So I'm rather hoping we might get some changes. I would like us to look over the channel at European healthcare systems. I'm up for full-blown change there. So
I know, but that then kind of heralds in the idea of some kind of quasi-privatisation. If you have, like, a German system, then obviously it's some private, some state. I was just going to ask you, Mark, whether you rated Rachel Reeves and what your impression is of her so far.
Yeah, I think she's pretty competent, actually. I mean, it's difficult to discern any form of ideology, really. She comes across more as an accountant or an economist, but she strikes me as actually having a relatively safe pair of hands. Truth be known, from my perspective, it's not very obvious to me what the next Labour government, if indeed there is one, will do very differently to this Conservative government.
Well, that's the problem, because she keeps on banging on about 13 years of Tory rule, and then when asked, well, would you reverse these tax cuts, she can say nothing other than probably not no.
More of the same under a different face.
More of the same. Migration, is it economically good or bad, Mark?
I think it's very difficult to give a good or bad on that. It depends on which types, which cohorts. I was listening to you earlier interviewing the Minister, where you pointed out that the Conservatives have missed their tens of thousands target. I did hear one cheeky Conservative saying to me, no, we haven't, it's 74 tens of thousands that have come in. It can be good, but it's a question of the nature of that immigration. If people who are coming in, I mean, the way I would look at it, if people who are coming in who are basically net contributors, let's say paying more tax than they're receiving in benefits, doing key jobs in the private sector or the public sector, well, that can be a benefit. I don't see there's any problem with, I don't know, another 50,000 rich, talented North Americans moving to the United Kingdom would be a boon for the economy. But if people are coming in who are adding still more burden on our welfare state and our public services, then we've got a problem.
But the Treasury doesn't seem to see it that way. The Treasury seems to think that more numbers that come in are plugging gaps which may not be being filled by people who are actually on welfare, and therefore it kind of masks the situation with regard to our own homegrown talent. What about Boris Johnson's idea of having that cap at £40,000 for people coming in and wanting to apply for visas?
Yeah, I get that, and I would be thinking along a similar sort of line. But to my mind, it isn't necessarily just about your salary. I'm supposing that you wanted, for some reason, to relocate to the UK. You're not intending to work, but you're worth $10 million and you want to retire here. I think I would gladly welcome you in, as long as you claim no benefits. So although we sort of look at the salary or the wages, how much you're earning as the key task, I think we should actually be looking at how much are you squeezing out of the system, taking from the state, taking from other taxpayers. And if that is naught, or if you like below, that you're a net contributor, then you're more than welcome. But if your claims, especially if your dependents as well, are a further drag, then our public spending position worsens still more.
Final cue. What's happened to your reported peerage?
The Lords work in very mysterious ways. I've spent my entire adult life very successfully, if I may say so, irritating and infuriating the political establishment, so I'd be wholly unsurprised if I'm cancelled.
Well, hang on a minute. You were once chief spokesman for the Liberal Democrats. You've worked
I irritated them. Yeah.
You irritated them, I'm sure. You worked for David Cameron, so you have had quite a varied career.
Yeah.
But Liz Truss proposed you for a peerage, and then what's happened? Literally, what have you been told? I'm interested.
No,
I'm intrigued.
you really hear nothing, Camilla. They don't.
So you think you have
write.
been nominated by Liz Truss, but do we think it's been blocked, that you've been taken off a list?
By this mysterious committee called HOLAC. The Bible says the Lord works in mysterious ways. Trust me, the House of Lords works in even more
So do you think maybe because you're a Truss ally or seen as somebody that advised her that you've now been made persona non grata?
I've always been persona non grata in many corridors of power.
So are you going to end up with this peerage or not?
I haven't. You know what? I guess not.
Give me a chance out.
I'd guess not. I'd guess
and
not.
is that disappointed you?
Well, it means I'm going to have to work for a living, but, you know, hey,
all right.
we should all do that.
You're always welcome back on this show.
Bless
Mark
you.
Littlewood, thank you very much. Lovely to see you this morning. I'm hoping now to be joined by Steve McCabe. He's the Labour MP for Birmingham Selly Oak. He's also Parliamentary Chair of the Labour Friends of Israel. Steve, thank you for your time this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Let's talk about what Labour might do with the economy. I appreciate you're not in power. You're probably going to tell me we haven't written our manifesto yet. But at the same time, do you, in principle, agree with what was announced in the autumn statement, Steve?
Well, I don't really think the autumn statement's going to make that much difference, if I'm honest. I mean, who's going to object to the national insurance tax cut? It's broadly an OK thing, but I think it works out about the cost of, like, fish and chips on a weekly basis. It's worth about £9-10 a week, isn't it? Okay. I think the extension of the capital investment arrangements are good for businesses, but actually I was just out over the weekend talking to some small businesses. They didn't know anything about it.
Therefore, do you think that when the time comes for Labour to set out more of its economic plan to the public, obviously hoping to be elected whenever the election is next year, that they're going to have to present a tax-cutting programme that goes beyond the autumn statement? Because we've just been hearing from Mark Littlewood here from the IEA talking about the economic legacy that Labour may inherit, and it's going to be... There's going to be enormous pressure on Chancellor Rachel Reeves, if the time comes for her to be appointed to that role, to actually either cut spending or put taxes up in order to balance the books.
Yeah, I agreed with a lot of what Mark said, actually, but I think the difference is about whether or not you have fair taxation. We think there are obvious targets where there could be fairer tax. You know, big companies, online sales transactions that avoid paying tax in this country, non-DOMs, which, you know, the Prime Minister may have a special reason for not wanting to tax, I don't know. We think that it's not so much about who's paying tax, because everyone knows that we're paying far too much tax. I think it's the largest for over 70 years, but it's about who is paying it.
Yes. Do you regard somebody earning £50,270 a year as wealthy?
No, I don't, and I think that's part of the problem of freezing the tax allowances. We're drawing lots of people, you know, police inspectors, head teachers. We're drawing far too many people into the higher rate of tax.
Yeah. Do you think that Labour would be wise to propose unfreezing those tax thresholds when the time comes?
Well, I think Rachel Reeves would say to me, "You can't write my budget, Steve McCabe." But I think it's something we'd want to look at because it isn't fair, and we know it isn't fair.
Can I ask you about how it's been over the last 4 to 5 weeks chairing the Labour Friends of Israel group? I mean, obviously, we've seen a lot of infighting within the Labour Party, some demands for a ceasefire on one side, Keir Starmer holding the line on resisting that, talking about humanitarian pauses, which, to be fair, we've seen the results of this weekend. But is it difficult to keep the Labour Party together on this really important issue, Steve?
Well, I mean, as you say, we have seen some benefits in the last couple of days, and I think we're all praying that that will lead to something better, and that's certainly the strategy we've been supporting. I think it is difficult for Labour MPs who live in areas where there are large Muslim numbers of constituents. But, I mean, we've all had a difficult time. I had about 300 people blocking my advice centre last Saturday and stopping my constituents coming to see me. I mean, we really have to look at these protests. They're a very funny coalition of people, and I think a lot of them, I'm not saying all of them, but I think a lot of them are people who are more interested in finding a reason to protest and really caring about what's happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Although you've got a lot of Labour colleagues who have been marching with them and they're seemingly on their side. You know, this idea of free Palestine, they seem to be saying free Palestine from Israel and not Hamas.
Well, exactly. Look, there can only be... I want to see a free Palestine as well. It's a Labour Friends of Israel objective. I want a two-state solution. I want to see both the Israeli people living in safety and security and the Palestinian people in a free state living in safety and security. But you can't do that when part of the potential Palestinian state is being dominated by a terrorist organisation. It's absurd.
I mean, that scene outside your office, Steve, must have been pretty intimidatory. Is it acceptable, frankly, for pro-Palestinian or any marchers to be marching outside MPs' offices? I know Wes Streeting also got a load of stick. I mean, this puts people off entering public life, doesn't it?
Well, it's not very nice. I mean, let's not pretend about it. But I think what's worse is that people who come to see MPs at an advice centre often have quite difficult problems. They're sometimes quite vulnerable people. Maybe they haven't been there before. They're quite nervous. These are the people who are being put off. They're being intimidated from coming to see their MPs by often quite well-heeled people who've got the luxury of protesting.
Yes, that's right. Steve McCabe, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Well, let's continue the conversation about Israel and indeed Palestine and Gaza with Ayelet Shaked. She's an influential Israeli politician. She's the former Minister of Justice and the former Minister of the Interior. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's obviously extremely difficult. We have seen these humanitarian pauses this weekend return some Israeli hostages to their families. Heart-rending scenes, really, particularly of seeing those much, much younger children reunited with their parents, some of the more elderly hostages, 85-year-old women, Holocaust survivors, reunited. Can this continue? Are you confident that Israel and indeed the Palestinians will be able to continue brokering further releases as hostages as we go forward?
Yes, I hope. We have 2 more days, and today more children should be released. They took little babies, little girls, as hostages. It's something that, it's unbelievable. You can't imagine that. And we have like something like 40 children in the hands of the Hamas. So we hope that we will be able to get all of them back home. We are waiting for all of them here. There is a little baby, 9 months old. His name is Kfir. And we didn't get any sign about him yet. And we hope that those monsters that took our children will release him as well.
Yes.
But yes, I hope that we will get them all.
We obviously have heard a great deal from Benjamin Netanyahu and indeed the Israeli Defense Forces talking about destroying Hamas. At what point does Israel decide that Hamas has been destroyed? Obviously, there is a question of proportionality. You need the Western world on side with what you're doing. Destroying Hamas at any cost?
No, there is no question of proportionality. After they slaughtered our babies, they raped our girls, they burned our children. So we are not talking about proportionality. By the way, the IDF is the most moral army in the world. You know that we act according to the international law. And you need to be aware of the fact that the Hamas is using their own population as a human shield. And Hamas will be defeated. It means that the leaders of Hamas will either surrender or they will all be dead, and that the Hamas will not be the regime in Gaza Strip anymore. And we are not there yet, but we are not going to stop. After what they did for us, the Hamas launched a barbaric genocidal attack on Israel on October 7th, and we will eliminate them. It will take time. We have this time because we don't have any other choice. It is either us or them.
Who governs Gaza after this and at the end of this? I mean, I know you've made some comments in the week. You've talked about the future of 2 million Gazans. You've talked about them being accommodated by Egypt. What happens to Gaza at the end of this?
I think that the international community should help here. There are moderate Arab countries like the UAE, like Egypt, that can, help as some, to create alliance of Arab moderate states as first stage. But let's wait and see. This Hamas organization will not be the ruler of Gaza anymore after what they did.
So if they're not the ruler, who is in charge? And what happens to the people of Gaza?
The people in Gaza right now are suffering because of the Hamas. Actually, Israel, we will liberate the people in Gaza from the Hamas because, as I said, they are using their own population in order as a human shield. So let's wait and see. I think here that the international community should help us, not just, broadcast in the world media about how miserable the people in Gaza, but really help with humanitarian aid and help with the solution. I think that if the international community will build an alliance of few countries that are willing to take responsibility, it can be the first stage.
Is Benjamin Netanyahu the right Prime Minister for Israel to lead that international alliance, do you think? There have been criticisms of him before this conflict and during it for his handling of the matter.
I'm not talking about the internal politics in Israel right now. Right now, all the people of Israel, we are all united to eliminate the Hamas. It doesn't matter if you're left or right, religious or secular. We all understand that we can't live next to this Nazis organization after what they did on October 7th. So we are united to do that. I think that the whole world should be unified to release all the hostages and to bring them back to Israel. There are young girls there that we didn't talk about them yet. That those monsters, they did horrible, they murdered, they raped our women, and we don't know what happens to them right there in Gaza. And right now we are all united and doing a huge effort in order to bring everyone back to Israel and to eliminate those Nazis monsters.
Do you think, in retrospect, considering the lack of intelligence around the October the 7th attack, that retrospectively all this should be investigated, how it came to pass that the Israeli Defence Forces and indeed the government seem to have been taken completely unawares by what happened at the kibbutz and at the festival on October the 7th?
So we will do, after we will win this war and eliminate the Hamas, we will do an investigation and we'll investigate everything in all the aspects. But it's not the time to do it right now. Right now, it's the time to win.
OK. Ayelet Shaked, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to speak to you. Now, don't go anywhere, because the UK's biggest march against anti-Semitism since the Second World War will be taking place in London later today. I'll be speaking to one of the march's organisers in just a moment.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Let's bring Michael Portillo, my GB News colleague, into the conversation. Michael, what have you got coming up today?
Camilla, good morning. We're going to be looking a little bit at Ukraine, which has been rather neglected.
Yes.
We're also going to be discussing the election result in the Netherlands, which has been very extraordinary. We want to know if that's part of a European pattern. We'll be asking whether UK overseas aid is quietly being converted into reparations for British imperialism. This is following new guidance that's been offered by the Foreign Office. And then on the cultural side, we're going to be looking at Roald Dahl's Witches and Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, both of which are in the theatre and on tour. And by the way, this week I went down to the Dulwich Picture Gallery and saw a marvellous exhibition of Rubens and women, and I have a little report on that as well.
That sounds very culturally enlightening, as ever is the case.
That's what it's meant to be.
And also I'm intrigued to find out what you think about Roald Dahl's Witches, which I found quite scary as a kid.
I think it is quite a scary production.
But just brilliant, though, and visceral and amazing. I mean, if only children's books were written like Roald Dahl did these days. Michael, very much looking forward to that at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much indeed. Now, let's bring Stephen Silverman into the conversation now from the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Good morning. You've got a very busy day ahead. Tell us about this march. Why have you organised it? How many people do you hope might join?
Good morning, Camilla. Thank you for having me on. So, look, it's now almost 2 months since the worst atrocity against the Jewish people since the Holocaust was perpetrated in southern Israel by Hamas. The reaction to that, even before Israel began its response, was a massive outbreak of anti-Semitism, not just here but around the world. In London, the Metropolitan Police have reported an increase of 1,350% over the same period last year. British Jews are terrified like never before. They feel abandoned by the institutions who are meant to protect them. They feel alone. For 7 consecutive weeks, we've had weekends feeling like no-go areas for the Jewish community with awful scenes of anti-Semitic incitement and hatred. And so the purpose of today is to say no, enough. It's for Jewish people from all over the country to take a stand alongside their very, very many friends, allies and supporters of all faiths and none, and to say, no, this is not what the UK is about.
Yes.
These are not UK values.
How do you think that the protests have been policed? Do you think they've been policed well? You talked about the arrests. Some people have felt extremely uncomfortable seeing people, for instance, chanting from the river to the sea. There's a lot of people who are marching, of course, who are trying to do it in a peaceful way, who aren't being anti-Semitic at all. What's your evaluation of what we've seen in recent weeks on the streets of London?
Look, it is very difficult to make the case that you're chanting and marching for peace when you're also chanting for jihad and to globalise the Intifada. And for people who don't know, the Intifada were a series of violent uprisings against Israel in which many, many Israeli civilians were murdered through suicide bombs. So, these marches have been punctuated by genocidal chants, by demands for the Muslim armies to assemble for jihad. We have images of the Stars of David entwined with swastikas, comparisons of Israel with the Nazi regime.
I mean, are you confident that the Met has clamped down on those sorts of people? I mean, one would imagine that if you're carrying a banner conflating the Star of David with the swastika, then you should be immediately arrested. I mean, have you seen evidence that that's actually been happening, or has it been too lacklustre?
I've seen reports that happened yesterday, but for 6 weeks there was a terrible lack of action. And the Jewish community was even gaslit by Sir Mark Rowley about the meaning of some of these chants.
Yes.
And how...
There were different meanings to jihad.
Yeah, jihad. It can be in a contemplative reflection. Well, I'm sorry, but when you're chanting to globalise the Intifada and for Muslim armies to assemble, jihad doesn't mean let's all come together and calmly...
I mean, obviously not all of the marchers were doing this, but there were elements of this march that were doing this, and that's what you're objecting to. I'd like to know your opinion on the BBC and how it's handled its coverage of this conflict, but also the decision that appears to have been taken by BBC bosses that BBC staff shouldn't go on the anti-Semitism march, even though my understanding is that no such diktat was given when it came to people who wanted to march in the spirit of freeing Palestine.
Well, let me respond to the second part of your question first. So this clearly is about impartiality and avoiding anything that is political or partisan. How a march against anti-Semitism, how a march against racism can be categorised as partisan and something that should be avoided beggars belief. And I think it's an absolutely disgraceful decision by the BBC, and sadly it's been part of what we've seen from the BBC throughout this conflict, a rush to judgment, a rush to accept Hamas reports and figures. It has directly impacted international peacekeeping events.
Yes.
Its report on the what appeared to be the bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza absolutely scuppered a planned meeting between the President of the United States and in Saudi Arabia. So it's been atrocious. And yesterday, a video was released of an interview with Jeremy Bowen, who acknowledged that his reporting had at times been inaccurate and sat there and said, no, I don't regret it. I don't think I've got anything to apologise for. It's scandalous.
I mean, obviously, he's not here to defend himself from that, but that is what he said. What's also your reaction to some of Gary Lineker's tweets? He tweeted a video in which somebody was describing Israel as having perpetrated a genocide. He retweeted that video.
Well, I think it's an indication of how celebrity can lead people into thinking that they're qualified to comment on incredibly complex matters.
I mean, should he be sanctioned by the BBC for that?
Well, the BBC has a policy on this now, and they need to determine whether or not he's within that policy or whether he has brought them into disrepute. You know, just because someone happens to be Jewish and then likens what's going on to a genocide, says it doesn't make it accurate, it doesn't make it true. And the word genocide is being bandied around horribly freely. So that is a major concern when you look at the number of followers that people like Gary Lineker have on social media and the extent to which they can be influenced.
How big a problem is anti-Semitism in schools? We've heard a lot about anti-Semitism on campuses. I know that 500 alumni, for instance, from University College London wrote to the Vice-Chancellor and complained about what it perceived to be anti-Semitism on campus. But we've also heard reports of Jew hate in playgrounds. Well, you know, it's not surprising, and we are receiving similar reports. What sorts of reports are you receiving?
Similar to that, like young children who pick up information and comments about what's currently going on, and then without really understanding what they're saying, will then use it against fellow Jewish pupils. And it is a huge problem. But the issue of education and anti-Semitism in this country is something that is going to have to be taken very seriously and dealt with. You know, we at a recent pro-Palestinian march did some vox pops, and we caught two young women, very young women, on video saying in 1948 the Palestinians welcomed the Jews with open arms. They gave them homes. They gave them everything they needed to feel settled and welcome and safe. And now look what they've done. And you think, you know, where on earth is this information coming from? What is education doing in this country to ensure that these narratives are corrected? That should just be common general knowledge.
But do you also worry about social media? I noted that the actor and comedian Sacha Baron Cohen spoke out in the week against TikTok and said that TikTok was poisoning the minds of a generation against Jews. Do you agree with that? What can the government do about that, do you think? What should they do?
Well, I mean, social media has been the cauldron in which anti-Semitism has been brewed up for certainly the 8 years that I've been doing what I do with Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. It enables views that people would previously once have only been able to express in the privacy of their own home or in the corner of a bar, for them to come together as a constituency and get hateful messages out to God knows how many people in the blink of an eye. And it's completely unregulated, despite the fact that all social media companies, they say they have policies against hate speech. It's still there.
Yes.
You can complain about it and get responses from all the social media companies saying this doesn't contravene our community standards. So there does need to be regulation. And we hope that the Online Harms Bill will actually go some way to addressing this. But it is like the Wild West. It is a cauldron of hatred out there on occasion.
Well, hopefully today will be a moment of hope for your people and your community, with lots of support on the streets of London. I know you have to go from here to there.
Indeed.
I wish you all the very best for later. Thank you very much for joining me this morning, Steve.
Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. Well, lots more to come, or at least one very interesting conversation coming about Churchill and the people he met. I'm going to be speaking to the author Sinclair Mackay about his new book on Britain's greatest Prime Minister. Stay tuned for that.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I've been looking forward to this part of the show all of the show because I'd like to hear about Churchill. And Sinclair Mackay is with me now. He's the author of a new book, Meeting Churchill, A Life in 90 Encounters. The book tells Winston Churchill's life story through the prism of memories from 90 different people who met him. Sinclair has trawled through mountains of diaries, memoirs and letters to put all this together, and it features accounts from some of the 20th century's most famous people, thinking Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein, also some of those who were closest to him. So it really is a riveting read. Let's have a look at it now, just so you can see it in time for Christmas, in all good bookshops, as they say. Sinclair, it's fascinating, this. I mean, we know a lot about the man, and indeed, we'll get onto it in a moment, because sometimes I feel as if history's been rewritten slightly about Churchill.
Indeed,
but some of the people he met and some of the anecdotes about what he said to them and how he behaved with key people. I mean, for instance, tell me about Charlie Chaplin and this slightly uneasy relationship he had with him.
He and Charlie Chaplin were actually, they were friends. They met across the decades. They first met in 1920s Hollywood, when Churchill was out there plugging one of his books, and Charlie Chaplin was literally the most famous man in the world. He was much more famous than Churchill at that stage. And they met at some incredibly glamorous kind of Hollywood party. They couldn't quite size each other up. Here were two of the finest wits in the room, rapier wits, and they couldn't quite find the level to sort of address each other. But they knew that they were sort of drawn to each other. Then Chaplin went to stay at Churchill's house, Chartwell, in Kent, in the early 1930s. Churchill took him through his whole hinterland of eccentric hobbies, from the bricklaying to showing Charlie Chaplin the swans that he kept.
Oh, to have been a fly on the wall during that encounter.
Well, on top of that, Churchill learnt that Chaplin wanted to make a film about Napoleon. We've got Ridley Scott's Napoleon out at the moment. I think I'd much rather have seen Charlie Chaplin's Napoleon. And Churchill suggested some comedy ideas for it. So he was suggesting comedy ideas to Chaplin because Churchill was a great cineast, and he considered himself something of an expert in cinema. So you see them crossing over, and they meet in the late 1950s when Chaplin happens to be having dinner at the Ritz with his fourth wife, Una, and they discuss Chaplin's last film. So they crisscross across the decades.
Before we get on to some of the political relationships, I was also intrigued with how he got on with Albert Einstein. I mean, on one hand, the great mathematician. I don't think Churchill was particularly famed for his scientific mind, but more his literary mind.
Calculus. He said that a quadratic equation was something that was at the portals of Alice in Wonderland for him. It just wasn't happening. He couldn't get into artillery or engineers in Sandhurst Military College because he didn't have the maths. But he drew mathematicians to him and physicists to him like a flame. Now, Albert Einstein was actually a rather moving meeting between them in 1933. Einstein again went to visit Churchill at Chartwell in Kent. Hitler had just come to power in Germany. Einstein saw instantly what this meant to Germany's Jews, and he led an initiative to try and get as many German physicists out of Germany and into Britain as possible. And Churchill was fully behind this. There's a wonderful... There wasn't much of a transcript of their meeting in Chartwell, but there's a wonderful photograph of them both standing in Churchill's garden, bathed in this kind of radiant sun. Einstein with his hair standing on end, defying the laws of relativity, and Churchill there in one of his onesies. And you think, what a wonderful meeting that was. And it was Einstein who said of Churchill, he is eminently wise.
Wow.
Rather than the other way around.
Well, high praise from Einstein of all people.
So,
And then, obviously, the relationship between Churchill and Eisenhower has been much written about. But tell me a bit more about how they got on. I mean, I remember studying at school, you know, them travelling around on that train with regard to trying to kind of work out how to play the next stages of the Allied war effort. How did they get on?
Because, again, one of the things we're quite familiar with in terms of Churchill is the sheer gravity of obviously the war effort. But on top of this, there were some extraordinary kind of lighter moments that Eisenhower particularly recalled. Eisenhower remembered how Churchill had the habit of talking late into the night about military campaigns, and he would invoke everything from Greek classics to Donald Duck in his efforts to explain these Peloponnesian Wars. And Eisenhower loved all that, but he said that when he was staying at Chequers, he was put in an ice-cold bedroom, first of all, and a four-poster bed, which he said was just something from the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell. And he awoke in the night, having had a terrible nightmare that he was being strangled. Eisenhower dreamt that he was being strangled, and he woke up to discover that it wasn't that. He had borrowed Churchill's voluminous nightgown, and it had wrapped itself around his neck throughout the course of the night.
My goodness me. Now, I would imagine as you researched this book, you may have found out a few drunken encounters with Churchill. I mean, we know famously the Bessie Braddock story. Just give us the line again, because I know it's often repeated, but Churchill said to her...
It's often repeated and it's very politically incorrect. Bessie Braddock said to Churchill, "Winston, you're drunk." And Churchill said to her, "Madam, you are ugly, but in the morning I shall be sober." Now, I mean, A, you wouldn't get away with that now, but B, there's a postscript to that story, which isn't at all known, but actually can be found in Bessie Braddock's own memoirs, which is, first of all, she's completely glided over it. She pretended it didn't happen. She'd been irritating and annoying Churchill on purpose throughout the years.
And Bessie Braddock was a kind of political adversary. Just explain who
she was a ferocious left-wing Liverpool MP, full of kind of absolute brimstone, loathing, just absolute tribal loathing of Churchill. But actually, behind the scenes, it wasn't as straightforward as that. She admitted that, yes, he was actually the greatest living Englishman, and on top of that, he had actually quite a large regard for her. He put her on a special commission for mental health in the 1950s, in his second term as Prime Minister. And she introduced him to a Nigerian boxer, a heavyweight champion who had come over to Britain.
Right.
And she desperately wanted to introduce him to Churchill because he idolised Churchill. And so there were moments of kind of honeyed accord between them. You know, they're famous for that one story, but actually, Churchill and his left-wing opponents often got on fantastically well.
I mean, was he a sociable man? Obviously, he wanted to gather the great and the good around him. He was interested in meeting interesting people of the era.
Absolutely, yes.
Yet at the same time, you know, one gets this picture of him with his black dog and him disappearing into the countryside at Chartwell and painting paintings that actually he was a bit of an isolationist figure, but perhaps that's not the case.
I think not at all, because he lived over the space of 90 years. I mean, he was born in 1874, the late autumn of the Victorian era. He lived right the way through to 1965 and the Rolling Stones, and in the course of those 90 years, he becomes almost like a sort of Shakespearean character in the sheer depth and range of his humanity. I mean, the Black Dog Depressions are kind of famous. They're possibly sort of slightly overdone, because there are others who suggest that, in fact, he wasn't kind of manic depressive. He just had episodes where it all got too much. And given the gravity of everything that he was dealing with, but, you know, not just in the war, but, you know, the First World War, fighting in Sudan and all the rest of it, would be understandable. But yes, that extraordinary kind of cavalcade. But he met and knew kind of everyone. Rupert Brooke, Violet Asquith, Lawrence of Arabia and he were great friends. And then lastly, he knew some figures such as Gracie Fields, Maria Callas. This is a life that takes in of not just politics and not just war either, because we know him primarily for war, but he had a fantastic passion for kind of art and literature and, yes, science too. His great friend, Professor Frederick Lindemann, who was a physicist, who kind of taught him the kind of rudiments and led to Churchill predicting wireless technology back in 1931. He made a speech, or he wrote an article in 1931 saying that given our current technology in 1931, we can predict that there will be wireless televisions and wireless telephones which will enable people to meet up almost as if they were meeting up across a city, but they wouldn't have to move from their rooms.
How very prescient. But at the same time, let's talk about some of the kind of revisionism that we've witnessed in recent years. I mean, this idea of recasting Churchill, who many regard, in fact, he was voted as the greatest Briton of all time, as sort of more villainous than that. I mean, what's your take on it, Sinclair?
Well, my take on it is that Churchill was certainly a child of empire, and throughout his life, he was bathed in a nostalgia for its golden sunsets. He had a very particular view of empire, which was kind of natural, because it was that was the world in which he grew up in. That was the air that he breathed. But you know, the current accusations are that he was a white supremacist, an imperialist, a racist, and that you can find episodes of that happening, but it isn't necessarily the whole story. For instance, during the war, when black GIs over in Britain were being segregated by their officers and not being allowed to go into pubs and cinemas, it was Churchill and the cabinet who objected to this, saying this is outrageous. You cannot have American-style segregation in Britain. That's absolutely wrong. Even before that, in 1904, when he was a Liberal MP, the very first ever aliens bill, it was called, to limit the numbers of immigration to Britain, it was Churchill who put out a pamphlet arguing against that,
So he was a
Britain has always
complex
been a place of
character.
refuge and so on. So yes, it's complex. People have always stuck labels on him. When I was growing up, he was the blood-soaked warmonger who carpet bombed civilians. But people didn't hero worship him at the time either.
Maybe we should just be a bit more nuanced. Sinclair Mackay's book here, it's Meeting Churchill, and it's available in all good bookshops. Thank you very much for coming in this morning and talking to me about it. I'll, of course, be back next week at 9:30. But up next, it's Michael Portillo. Have a great Sunday.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest